enjoy the words for your first time hearing it. So many of you have probably heard the expression, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Okay, you guys know it. Okay, I want to sort of play with that a little bit. I want to invert that a little bit, and I want to say the more things look like they stayed the same, the more they've actually changed. Okay, again, the more that things look like they stay the same, the more they've actually changed. So, you run into somebody you haven't seen in years, maybe at a reunion or shopping or whatever, and you say to the person, wow, you look great. You don't look like you've changed at all. Well, the truth is that person who still kind of looks like they did 20 years ago, they go to the gym a whole lot more than they used to. They eat a whole lot more healthy and a whole lot less than they used to, and they spend a whole lot more money on their skin and their hair than they used to, right? So again, the more it looks like it's the same, the more underneath it's all changed. Or you go to a store in your hometown and you walk in, you're like, wow, this just reminds me of when I was a kid, and you go up and you say to the storekeeper, wow, things haven't changed, and he or she looks at you and says, actually, 70% of our business is online. I don't spend hardly any time anymore in the store. I'm in the back emailing my international supply chain. Again, the more things look like they stay the same, the more than underneath they've undergone profound changes. Just to keep up with sort of the decay and change of life, in order to even look like we were before, we've got to adapt, change, and grow. Well, in the gospel story today, Jesus encounters this man. And the scene in the beginning of the story and the scene at the end look a whole lot alike. In the beginning of the story, there's this blind beggar. And as a beggar, right, he's on the ground, he's on his knees, and he can't see, but he's kind of following where the sound is, looking up with his arms outstretched. And then there's Jesus, who has now turned his attention to the man. And so that's the scene. Jesus standing looking at the man, and the man on his knees looking up, begging, hoping for something from Jesus. Okay. Well, we go to the end of the story. At the end of the story, again, Jesus is with the man, and we're told that the man worships Jesus. And to worship in the Bible, in Greek and in Hebrew, the original languages, actually means to be on your knees and to have your arms outstretched in humility and in praise. And so the man is once again down, humbly reaching up, and Jesus is once again looking at the man. The story begins and ends in the same way, but oh, how much has changed. The man can see there's become all sorts of divisions and all sorts of changes in his town. His relationship with his parents, everything is so different than the way it was. So it looks like it's the same, but everything about this person's life, what they do, how they relate to, what even is their hometown anymore, it's all been changed. Well, 3 years ago this weekend was Warwick's musical. And although there was this virus that was coming, the show must go on. And so the show went on, and as soon as that curtain closed, the school shut down. And it wasn't just in Warwick, right? It was all of the schools in this area, all the state, really all the nation. Everybody just sort of turned off the valves. And we know what was supposed to be a sort of a 2-week affair ended up just lasting a little bit longer than that. Well, that was then, but what about now? Well, 3 years later, I think it's safe to say that a lot of our lives have kind of reached a new normal. And I think for most of us, if we took a photo of our lives the first week of March 2020, and we took a photo of our lives the first week of March 2023, there'd be a few more gray hairs, but it kind of might look a little bit like it did 3 years ago at this point. Right? And restrictions are very minimal. We have to wear masks at the doctor's office, and many of us are like, we probably should have been doing that anyway, being around a bunch of sick people. But again, generally our lives kind of look more or less a little bit like they did before. But the more things look like they stay the same, the more they've changed. And for all of us, the past 3 years, because of the pandemic or just because the way life works after 3 years, are profoundly different. Where and how we work, with whom we associate, how we've dealt with the conflict within our family and friend circles, how we've grieved those who have died, how we play, again, how we work, even how we worship. There's been so much that has changed. So even if that photo just looks like it only has a few more gray hairs, we all know that the last 3 years have brought just a sort of a groundswell of change to all of our lives. And so what do we make of that? How do we process that? Well, in the gospel this morning, this encounter with this man really begins with the disciples saying, Lord, we want the executive report on who's to blame for this catastrophe. We want to know who sinned, the man or his parents. The people, the disciples, they want to do that thing we're so good at as humans of analyzing a problem and assessing blame. This is how we're wired. It's necessary for our survival. It's how we avoid future things happening to us. And every week it seems like we're getting a new report from some agency somewhere around the world about whether the virus started with rats and a bat in a market or whether it started in a lab. We're hearing another report about the effectiveness of this mitigation or the emotional and psychological consequences of this particular thing. And I think as a whole, as a society, it's necessary to do this kind of work so again, next time around we can be better prepared. But I'm not sure on an individual level how much it really helps me today or tomorrow to know whether it was because of a rat or a test tube in Wuhan. And also, I can learn all I can about what we should have done 3 years ago. But it doesn't change the way life happened, and it doesn't really change where I'm at right now. Jesus invites his disciples, really commands them, and says, look, it's not about assessing blame in the past. This isn't the game that Jesus wants to play today. Jesus instead wants to open up the eyes of his disciples to see the works of God. Again, Jesus isn't so much interested in assessing and figuring out the past, but Jesus wants to open up the eyes of the disciples to God's works in their midst. And so I invite you and I challenge you, I commend to you to reflect back on the last 3 years. And instead of sort of assessing the blame game, instead to say, how has God's works been evidenced in my life? Where has God been at work creating new life, healing, reconciling, opening up my eyes to new things that God is doing in this world? This last week or so, with the leadership of the church, with the staff and council, we've started to reflect on sort of where we've been the last 3 years. And if I were to take a photo of March 2020 and March 2023, I might say, wow, we're finally back. We finally have as many of you sitting in the pews as we did 3 years ago. It looks the same. But the more things look like they've stayed the same, the more they've changed. Like right now, I can say hi to those worshiping online. Didn't have that before. Almost, maybe 80, 100 people each week will in some way interact with us online in ways they couldn't before. We've also had the sacred grounds emerge, and we now have this beautiful outside sanctuary, an amphitheater. We're able to worship. I think about the renewed ties with the Christian Early Learning Center here. How that's so much deeper of a relationship again. And then I think about the whole sort of relational infrastructure, the way in which we're integrating and welcoming people. I could go on, but again, the more things look like they're the same, the more underneath there's been profound changes. And we're called upon and invited as a church, but also as families, as individuals, to look back and to offer God thanks and praise for the good works of God in our lives and God's faithfulness these past years. But some of you at this might say, Pastor, I get it. You're supposed to be positive. I get it. And I get it. We're supposed to be grateful, and gratefulness is good for me. I get it. But when I think back on the last 3 years, and maybe for some of you, you're recognizing there really was a lot of hurt and loss. And maybe for some of you, you're still dealing with the effects physically of long COVID. Maybe others of you really feeling very cautious because of immunocompromised people in your family. Maybe for some of you, just the trauma of the conflict, sort of the lingering emotional scars, the distancing, the changing of jobs, of churches, of everything else. It just kind of leaves one kind of weary. Am I saying to avoid reflection on that? No. Turns out that today, when Jesus sees this man, he's moved with compassion and he takes a step towards the man. And everybody else in town is kind of scared of this man. And the reason why is because for this man, his blindness wasn't simply a physical handicap. It was a deformity, and one that was a cause of shame. Again, his blindness wasn't just a physical thing for this community. It was a spiritual, a moral thing. The whole time, it's like, again, who sinned? And later on, the Pharisees even directly look at him and say, you were a sinner from birth. Again, this blindness isn't just a physical thing, but it's a spiritual thing. He's an embarrassment. He's shameful in his state. But what Jesus does is Jesus is never afraid to get dirty for us. Jesus isn't afraid of the muddiness of real life. And so he gets down on the ground and he begins to make clay. And then when he touches the man, what he does at that moment is he binds himself to the man's shame. Okay? The shame that village looks at that man, as Jesus touches him, Jesus says, I am one with this person. The way you exile him is the way you exile me. Jesus, again, attaches himself to the person's shame. And Jesus absorbs that shame to then open up the man's eyes. Again, Jesus binds himself, takes the man's shame, and instead then opens up his eyes. He who knew no shame became shame for our sake, that our eyes might be open to God's works. So what does this look like in our lives? Well, this weekend is St. Patrick's Day, which is an excuse for everybody to pretend they're Irish, go to an Irish bar and drink too much, which has nothing to do with St. Patrick. But St. Patrick was he actually wasn't born in Ireland. He actually wasn't canonized and his real name wasn't Patrick, but that's okay. It was a long Welsh name because he was born in Wales. And anyway, he was kidnapped by pirates as a youth. He was literally kidnapped by pirates as a youth off the coast of Wales. He was taken to Ireland where he was sold into slavery. And he was raised as a slave. But eventually he's able to break free. He's a runaway slave. And he gets on a boat and he goes to France where he becomes a priest. And then he goes back to Wales. But then something happens where God is working on his heart, and God calls him back to the very country where he was enslaved. And I think about this. What a source of shame in his life to say to people, I was a slave. I had no rights. I was property of other humans. But what happened was that Jesus encountered him in the spot of his shame and opened his eyes. And he opened Patrick's eyes and he said, you have a heart now and you have compassion. And suddenly Patrick's eyes were open to the needs of the Irish people, to hear the good news of God's transforming love. You see, this is the God we have in Jesus Christ, the one who, again, isn't afraid to get dirty, isn't afraid to take our shame, that our eyes might be open. And this is what Jesus Christ has done for all of us in the cross, bearing our shame, that he might give us his resurrection, his sight. And this is what Jesus does in our lives. So as we're invited this day to reflect on the last few years, we can acknowledge and call to mind the times in our life that really were harder, where there was profound division, like in this story, where there was tension in our families, where there was healing that seemed to take longer, where it wore us out. And there we can see Jesus encountering us, turning our sickness into health, transforming our isolation into community, transforming our shame into his honor, transforming our sins into forgiveness. Thanks be to God.